Thanks for your time today, and apologies for the change in the title that you might have seen earlier when it was announced that I would be speaking. I had to make some changes at the last minute because I wanted to present some new work, but that work was not ready to share. So this is kind of like a placeholder title. Um, and I will be talking about a project from last year and a very new, fresh project as well. What I want to do today is really, in presenting these projects, start to think about what is the sort of lived reality of AI and how do we study it as people who are interested in the socio-technical, cultural, political, and economic aspects of this technology. Now, what we see a lot around us these days is a methodology of mapping. And we see, because the systems are black box systems, because um, you don't know how they function. Sometimes we have certain mental models about what we think technologies are that may not really match the reality of those technologies. And one of the first things that we see happening from people who are thinking more critically about tech is and especially black box technologies like AI and algorithmic systems, we see a lot of mapping projects. And on the screen, you should see Kate Crawford and Vladan Mueller's Calculating Empires, maybe about 6 years ago, or maybe 7 years ago. Crawford and Mueller made something called Anatomy of AI that was quite similar, that kind of unpacked how Amazon's Echo device, where it comes from, and a similar kind of visual black and white visual map. And there was an essay which went with that, and that was a very lovely project that helped people understand kind of the relationship between natural resources and labor and users. And I think it's been very inspirational for a number of people. And this year they released Calculating Empires, which goes back into 500 years of how we arrive at AI. I haven't seen it, on a wall, and I think this is one of those mapping projects that is meant to be seen on scale because I don't, I'm a little critical of this, I'll say, because I don't know what it's supposed to represent, and I think it's kind of, or rather, it's trying to represent the unrepresentable in some ways. And I think it's meant to be seen on a wall. Of course, this is online. You can zoom in and see a lot of detail into it. But I introduce it here to kind of show the dominance of the mapping and investigating mode of understanding AI as kind of one of these methods that allows us to potentially try and see something that actively resists being seen. And similarly, you have like Anna Valdivia's map, Decoding AI, which is about looking at the supply chain of the production of AI, production of things like chips, supercomputing chips that are essential for AI. There's a big discussion in Europe and the UK about the environmental and footprint, the water footprint, the energy footprint of AI in terms of its data centers and what it requires to actually make things like chips. Um, and this is this is literally a map. But again, it's kind of looking at the supply chain, and supply studies is a very, very big area that we're all quite familiar with, whether it's, a bowl of soup or a computer. We know where things come from, and that's because the chains again have been obfuscated, and it's not possible for us to see where things come from because much of modern life is based on not seeing and not knowing. And so we bring those same instincts to AI, and um, there's a different moment as well when you think of methodologies that try to repair harm or seek accountability. So there's a big discussion also about algorithmic bias and fairness and accountability for harms from AI systems. There's so many controversies and scandals because these are very new systems, and some of them are quite brittle. They work very well in some contexts. I mean, we're just talking about things like image generation. I would ask you to go take a look at Runway and see what happens, or Unstable Diffusion, and see what happens when you put similar kinds of prompts in there, and see what happens when you I'm also curious if you're refining prompts and saying, well, like especially the one with the AI art, what happens if you say, don't show me humanoid robots? What does the system then do in response? So in some contexts, AI works very well. In other contexts, they don't. We have quite substantial examples of quite egregious harm by AI systems or algorithmic systems. And so you have a whole industry of journalists and policymakers and lawyers trying to sort of reverse engineer the decision making that led to the implementation of certain AI systems to understand where was the harm. And quite often it's about the system is working just fine, but maybe it was not meant for making a determination about identifying fraud. It's very good at, maybe making predictions about um, loans, who will repay loans. So I'm referring to the Dutch child welfare benefits scandal. You can look that up, where the Dutch government basically implemented a system to identify who was defrauding the state. And it turned out that there was a lot of biased information that targeted immigrants and people for whom Dutch was not their first language. And similarly, in the UK, you had the A-level algorithm where they tried to, because of the pandemic, students couldn't sit for their exams and they kind of predicted scores. But the scores and these are school leaving scores for people going to university, a lot of the predictions were on the basis of past data that, assumes that if you live in a postcode or area which is thought to be quite wealthy, you'll do better, you'll get better marks. So there were all kinds of biases coming into these systems. But again, you can't see the system itself. You can't understand how it's working. And a lot of that information is proprietary. So makers of the systems can't share and don't share the information. So the people around who are thinking about accountability have to reverse engineer the social systems to understand how decisions were made, but also try to understand how the technology itself was making the decision. So you have these two kinds of modalities for understanding and studying AI and how it works in the world. And I want to move to talking about this sort of real world of technology, of AI of AI as something that is now very much part of our lived everyday experience. And what do we understand about a technology that's now here in not a seamless way, not in the way that the brochures of tech companies talk about it, but in sometimes quite haphazard ways, or in not uniform ways. So what I've put here is one of my favorite charts, and of course I will be sharing these slides with you after. I hope you can see it because sometimes the text is quite small. So this is a slide adapted by someone called Johannes Klingebiel, and I found this, on the internet. He's developed this chart based on Ursula Franklin's lecture essay from, I think it was 1990, The Real World of Technology. And Ursula Franklin is a Canadian Austrian physicist, and in Canada, every year they have like a very renowned person giving a lecture called the Massey Lectures. That's and it's broadcast on their national TV and radio. And she talked about the real world of technology, not as something that exists in a fantasy, as speculation and kind of in some far future, but something that people are actually using and that is shaping their worlds, that is very much, and that is also changing by being in the human world. So what it actually means in between this fantasy world and the real world, Klingebiel gives us two very nice sort of columns and a kind of framework to ask, are we thinking about the fantasy world or are we thinking about the real world? Now, it's interesting if you look at it, and I show this to many of my colleagues to ask, what aspect of technology are you studying? And if you look at the left side, the fantasy of technology, when you look at things like the magical discussion of AI, if you look at science fiction or utopias and dystopias. If you look at what technology could or might do in the future, you're still very much in that fantasy. And that fantasy is often made by people who are producing the technology and who have to market and sell the technology. But the real world of technology is about, it's things like when you study infrastructure, one of the first things you hear is, that it's the study of boring things. But I kind of out myself as somebody who loves the study of boring things. I love kind of hearing stories about when things break, when people hack things, when they fix things, when they talk about technology as part of their everyday lives. When standards are developed to integrate these technologies, this is all technology in use. Now, as a social scientist, as somebody who my background is in psychology, and then I moved to media and cultural studies, and I worked outside industry outside academia for a long time in civil society organizations. And all of this kind of made me really interested in the study of AI as study of digital media and technology as something that people actually adopt and use in their lives. Now, studying that stuff is much harder because you need money and you need time and you need access to how people use things. I mean, you can also make yourself, a subject of study, but that would be quite narrow, and you wouldn't have any critical distance from that. But there are many creative ways that you can actually study this real world of technology. And today I hope to present two of these, which hopefully give you a sense that, to study AI as something that lives in the world with us, there are different approaches you can take. So some of this comes from, or sort of, I want to sort of talk a little bit about some frameworks for doing this. And this comes from my book, which is just out now. You can scan this to go to the website, the publisher's website, where you can read the first chapter online and you can buy a copy of the book. It's quite a pretty book. It looks really nice, and I think we spent a lot of time on the design, so I hope you enjoy reading it as well. This was, yeah. So you'll see. Right. What I'm going to focus on right now is a framework that you see in the middle of the screen, where you see the words ideology, infrastructure, imaginary, and instrument as a sort of framing or way to think about what AI is, and then think about the sort of methodologies we might use to study it. And on on my right, socio-technical, imaginary, data, infrastructure, media. This is what I use in the book to understand the driverless car, because what I was saying in that book is that the book is about the study of ethics, about why and how ethics of AI became really significant and important, and what does it actually mean when you want to program values into a machine system and expect that the machine will act as if it's human and make these complex moral decisions. So to be able to study that, what I wanted to do was to first recognize that something like the driverless car, but also a lot of other artifacts and technologies exist in at least three registers at the same time, by this framework also four. These are overlapping. These are not kind of discrete categories. The first is, and I'll just talk about the driverless car context for a minute, because I'll move to the middle column in the next slide. So I imagine that I study the driverless car as something that has existed as a robot imaginary for a long time, since the 1930s. And since automobiles became very popular in the Western world, you had people who were engineers who are actively thinking about a car that drives itself. This is not something that's 10 years old. This is decades old, 70, 80 years old. There's always been the ambition to remove the human and just have like this pure connection between the machine and its environment, which is the road. So the book kind of looks at what is that imaginary, and socio-technical imaginary is a very specific framing from Sheila Jasanoff, which you can look at later online. Then the other approach is, or the other frame is recognizing that something like the driverless car is a data infrastructure. It's a very practical system of cloud computing. It needs training data. It's got mapping. It's got computer vision system. It's got cyber physical systems that exist within the car to make it function. And the third is that the driverless car is also still a car. It still holds on to this urban infrastructure, but also standards and functioning as one of the most important media forms of the 20th century. So I also kind of focus on the driverless car as just a car, as a conventional automobile, or rather not so conventional automobile that has to do things that a car does, which is to transport people from one place to the other. So in the book, I kind of analyze the car, kind of frame the driverless car in these three ways, and then sort of unpack, the ethics, crashes, things like that. But what I want to focus on is this middle section here of a way to study AI in terms of its infrastructure, its ideologies, its imaginaries, and as an instrument, and to recognize that at any point in time, we are usually talking about one of these, but all of the others also coexist alongside. And you can choose to focus on one in your study of it, in your understanding of it, but recognize that the others are also there. So when we say infrastructure, we mean, looking at AI in terms of its data, its computational requirements, looking at the algorithms and the models that are developed and running within it, understanding all of the, I think when we're at the university level, I think when we are studying technology and society, we really do need to understand how the technology works. And I'm personally, I get a little concerned when people talk about the technology without really understanding how it works. And I don't mean that, suddenly you're becoming a computer scientist. We're not. You don't need to know that kind of detail, but you do need to understand, what is the difference between a transformer model and a diffusion model? How does a model actually create an image? Where is that coming from? What is the rationale behind the system? Because when you do that, it allows you to understand the limits of possibility, the limits of the models, but also the limits of accountability for what they create, and the limits of imagination. And I mentioned the Dutch child benefit scandal. I put down the Taylor Swift deepfakes, because you can look at these things as applications, but you can also read them. It's quite interesting when you read them as infrastructural systems, because you then have to unpack what is actually happening. You're not really looking at the effects then. And soon I'm going to start talking about this model of looking at effects to study a technology. You're looking at the technology itself and kind of reverse engineering how it works, or kind of looking at what are the infrastructural elements in this story. The Taylor Swift deepfakes and many deepfakes often don't rely on very complex AI technologies. You can do deepfakes with quite simple things. The Taylor Swift deepfakes didn't require AI. They just required basic Microsoft technologies and Telegram. Similarly, ideologies, that these technologies are not value neutral. And when we want to study why governments or corporations, and not just tech corporations, but all kinds of industries and corporations want to use AI, quite often there's some values that are being advanced. Now, these could be just efficiency, but efficiency itself is quite a significant ideological apparatus that says, in society, we want things to go in a certain way. We imagine that our society should be acting efficiently, and by efficiently also in kind of economic terms and political terms, we want things to scale, or we believe that humans make rational choices. This is this idea of Homo economicus, the human who is always making rational choices, and this is the basis of most Western liberal democratic capitalist systems. So unpacking the ideologies behind AI, we have to find creative methods to do that, to understand where it's being deployed, who's deploying it, why they're deploying it. This is why sometimes we do mapping projects, or we try to understand things like there's a lot of interest in Silicon Valley and what people in Silicon Valley are doing and thinking, because we assume and we imagine that there are people who their values come into their technologies. And you can read that by not just the tech, but also what they're saying. Third, that I talked about kind of these future imaginaries, that we have imaginations of the future, but we can read these imaginaries through the literature. That's why we read science fiction, or you can even read policy documents, and you can see how governments or states or policymakers imagine what this future is going to look like. And finally, a lot of AI technologies are also just meant to do very specific things, like to identify, to write an essay. It's just a writing tool, or to edit something, or to make a prediction, create a model of who's going to repay their loan, who's likely to repay their loan, or who's likely to default on their loan. So we can use it, or for misinformation or whatever. So at any point in time when we're talking about AI, we can use this approach to understand the different dimensions of it. And I would say sometimes what happens is we focus just on one, not looking at the others. And we do that because of time, of resources. But I think it's always valuable to recognize it. Even if you can't study these other dimensions, they also exist. And so they're also presenting a space for what we don't know about the technology. Okay. So I think everyone has a sort of theoretical framing that influences how they understand technology in our world. And I think that one of the things that's really interesting and important for me is recognizing that it's quite it's quite easy for us to imagine that the tech is doing things in the world and it's causing something to happen. And that is a deterministic view. And in that, we assume that the technology has some effects. So there's a cause and effect model of technology. But if we go back to this one, the real world of technology, that column on the real world side assumes that humans are actually involved in shaping the technology. And I won't go into it in a lot of detail here, but social constructionism, social shaping, um, participatory approaches, these all assume that technology is not static, and that humans take technology, and by working with it, they remake it and they do something else with it. So it goes further and further away from its original intention. And a lot of tension arises from how humans use things and how designers intended them to be used. But that is the story of technology in the world. My favorite example is the story of the bicycle, and how the bicycle was that design was not just that didn't just come off an assembly line somewhere. There's many, many decades and centuries of social influence on how that bicycle took its actual shape. And you must have seen pictures of the bicycle. I should have had a picture here actually. The penny farthing, the one with the very big wheel and a little man sitting on the top of it, and another tiny wheel associated with it. This was in the 18th century. Yeah, 18th century, I guess, or 19th century, um, early 19th century. And that, why don't we have that anymore? Why did that fall out of fashion? That's because it didn't work for everybody. And there was actually social movements that said, this doesn't work for us, particularly women who wore very big, women's fashion actually was quite important in the story, because they wore like these big dresses that didn't make it possible for them. You had to run and jump onto that bicycle. And it was very popular amongst men because it was a way of showing off how strong they were and how macho they were. And women were like, we can't do it with these big dresses. So you got to change the shape of the bicycle. So, there are every technology has these stories of how people reshape the design of them. And you understand that by studying the materiality, studying where technologies break, studying how systems get automated. So there's, as you can see on the slide, there's many points at which you can study the sort of social shaping. So this makes you question then, is there just kind of like a straight line between technology and the world, or society? It often feels like that, but that's not really the case. And this is just to, I don't know if you're feeling like you want to do something interactive or you want to respond. If you don't want to, that's also totally fine. But I really like this exercise um, as a moment to sort of understand this relationship between social shaping and technology as something that's deterministic. And there's many scholars who have written about it. Again, I would point you to my book to see writing about tech determinism. Um, but here are 9 statements. This is kind of like a famous piece if you have done media studies. About a technology, and I've redacted this obviously because I want you to take a look at this and tell me if you think, could you put AI into where you see the black box? Like, do any of these statements, do they relate to AI? Because this actually, originally, this is from some decades ago. It's about a very, very, very different technology than AI. And I'm going to show you in the next slide what that technology is. But I'm just curious. There's also something kind of interesting. The first, I think maybe 1, 2, 3, 4. And if you and look at the first 4 and then look at the from 5 to 9, that's 1, 2, 3, 4. And then this one, Dash was invented as a result of scientific and technical research, where about, yeah, central processes of family, cultural, and social life. The first few, I think, speak about technology that things happen in the world directly because of it. And there's also in the second set, I think there's a more like these are social and cultural things that are happening at a large scale, that are much more kind of social processes. The first set seemed to be much more specifically about the technology itself having a more direct effect. Like there is a sort of difference in the way that these statements are put. This is actually about, why is this not moving? It's actually about television. And Raymond Williams is a quite famous Welsh media theorist, wrote a book called Television, Technology and Cultural Form. And it's so interesting to read something that was written 50 years ago and feel like, oh, this could actually still work now. What does that mean for how we think about technology? AI is so different from television. Um, but there are ways that it works in the world, in the real world, in the human social world, that maybe make it quite similar to television. And it doesn't map completely on, of course, there are differences. But when we think about the social and cultural and political effects, we can see that there are many relationships between older forms of media and newer forms of media. So when you can take a look at these in more detail when you have the slides. Okay. So that bit was kind of all about, the way we try to position AI as a technology that we might study as something that is part of our lives. And what I want to do now is to present 2 projects that I've been working on in the last year that try to adopt specific methods in doing that. So the first one is a project I did last year with with the PI was Professor Norcha Merez at the University of Warwick and Professor Alex Taylor at the University of Edinburgh. And so they brought together these 5 projects in 5 different cities, including one in Australia, to set up these street observatories of everyday AI. And myself and my colleague, Dr. Louise Hickman, we worked on the Cambridge Observatory. So, an observatory is kind of like a petri dish, kind of like a very specific space in which you go and take a focused view of something, of a phenomenon. And so what we wanted to do was to study how, in different contexts, can you use creative methods to engage everyday people in specifying what AI means to them, in kind of looking back at AI and understanding what it means at the level of the street. Because the street is an interesting place where AI is meant to be for the public and it exists in public. And it's something that is meant to make our public social shared lives better and easier, more efficient. But it's also something that, like, responsibility and accountability are a bit dispersed in the street, and things get very actively remade by the street because there's so much diversity in the street. It's a space that belongs to everyone. So these were the 5 cities in which we set up street observatories. Each group had a different kind of method and approach. And you can see them here. And they each were responding to a specific kind of problem. So in Coventry, they were responding to the testing of autonomous vehicles there and of new devices, audio sensors in the streets. In Edinburgh, they were responding to not so much AI, but kind of gentrification through technology. In Cambridge, we were looking at the problem of difficult crossings, where we heard from the city council that there were lots of accidents happening at crossings because of the very messy different kinds of mobility data and so on. So each observatory had its own kind of problem, had its own local partners, and had a different kind of method. So what we did in Cambridge and was to do an access data walk. And this is a methodology that was advanced by my colleague, Louise Hickman. Louise is deaf and disabled. She is in a wheelchair, and all her work is about access and technology and how technology works or doesn't work for the disabled communities. So what we did was we wanted to activate an understanding that, inclusion of disabled people is not just about a ramp to enter a building or to exit a building, but we were more interested in the mobility, like how do disabled people move in the street and what kinds of data make it possible for disabled people to move in the street. Because there was a lot of data analytics being used in Cambridge to understand patterns of mobility and to make predictions on that basis. And we were very curious about how disabled people feature in that population. But first, we wanted to study infrastructure. So you can, of course, the URL is there. You can look at it. But what we did was we worked with members of the Cambridge Local Council, where we gave them like these printouts of the space that they would walk around in. And we asked them to annotate as they were walking. And that was with me and with Louise. And if you've never walked with somebody who has limited mobility, then I would strongly advise that you do, because then you start to see the landscape around you very differently. And you start to recognize how the built environment and infrastructure is not made for people with disabilities. And the person with a disability could be like, all of us are going to be temporarily disabled at some point. Maybe you've broken your leg. Maybe you are unwell. Maybe you have a small child. And all of these things change how you move in the city space. So we worked with people to kind of like hand annotate these maps and recognize different kinds of data in the space around them, and think about these different kinds of mobilities. So that was super interesting project of a very tactile, practical methodology of working with people in the street. And each of the observatories was reporting on a different creative method, which you can read about there. And then I will quickly move ahead to this other project that I'm working on with the university library. So AI in the Street finished last year, and we put a website together, and it was a very preliminary, small project. And I think this year we're going to do a bigger report before the end of the year, sort of commenting on this methodology. This one, AI for Cultural Heritage, is thanks to a small grant within the university itself, where I'm working with the university library and my colleague, Professor Joel McKim, who is at the Birkbeck University of London. And you can see him there in the little screenshot in the corner. That's the only picture I have of Joel, and that's just on a call. So I just want to recognize that a lot of this work is also built on work that he's done as a digital media theorist who works in sort of cultural heritage, but also in games and virtual contexts. So the university library wants to think about how do people in the cultural heritage sector start to adopt and work with AI. And they want to, and these are mostly people who work in what we call the GLAM sector, GLAM, galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. So they want to think about how do AI tools work for people in that sector, and also like a community of practice to support people because it's not completely intuitive, or it's not automatic that these tools work for people working in the sort of niche sector. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a case study of why. So there's many problems in the GLAM sector, in the cultural heritage sector, that any technology has to deal with. And in many respects, we have these problems because earlier waves of digitization have not been effective. So you have many inaccessible collections. You have a lot of information that is not digitized. You have cultural objects that are they're not all paintings. You have sculptures, you have fragments, you have cloth, you have textiles, you have metal artifacts, you have many, many different kinds of materials in these collections. If you want AI, you have to first ask kind of like, what can the model do for you? What can the technology do for you? And the fact that many of these, the cultural knowledge or the knowledge of, let's say, an artifact like a mask or a sculpture or a cloth fragment, textile, or a painting, is not automatically kind of put into the AI model. There's knowledge around that artifact that maybe comes from many different places. And in the UK, especially, we're really having a big conversation about colonialism and the fact that many of these artifacts were taken in context of military aggression and colonial control. And so they were actively stolen from people in different parts of the world. And then they arrived here and they were shown here with knowledge that was maybe not appropriate and not correct and they were kind of, many objects were renamed. And I'm going to tell the story of one collection that we're working with to make it clearer. What's also interesting is there's not a lot of digitization that's happening. You might have heard that, the British Museum was actually hit by a lot of theft, and it was a big scandal that things were stolen. And one of the reasons they have not been able to actually find those artifacts, these incredible artifacts, that was because they were not digitized, because they have just so much that's not even on display yet anymore. And so they can't track them now. And then the other is that it's not like there's never been any digitization, but you have kind of older technical systems across different providers that don't work in the AI context, because any technology makes very clear that what its format is. It needs material, it needs data to be entered in a certain way. And if it's not entered in that way, then, it's much, much harder to work with them. So, there are problems. And what we're doing is we're working with a group called the Scott Polar Research Institute at the University of Cambridge. And this is a small research center, but it's also a little museum. And it only studies the Arctic and the Antarctic and what is called the third pole. So any part of the world where there is ice and glaciers. And they have some beautiful artifacts about about the Arctic and the Antarctic. But they also have these problems of a very patchy kind of digitization, a lot of undigitized material. There's a lot of mistakes that have been made in entering information into the databases. And they want to do something with AI, but there's a lot of uncertainty and anxiety about AI and, if AI can actually work for their sector. Um, and and there's a lot of push that to use AI, but they don't know how. So our project is trying to figure out, can AI do anything for the cultural heritage sector, like the Scott Polar Research Institute? Um, and and I think the Scott is also very aware of its own problems, many of these kinds of problems, and they want to do something. So uh, just to kind of close up now and tell you some stories about the Scott and the kinds of things we're dealing with. So specifically around things like when you have data that is incorrect or where there's contested information about artifacts, when you put things into AI models, or rather AI models kind of actually you don't input anything. They search the web or they search databases for, well, training data for information about anything and then spit that out. If the information in that training data is contested or wrong, then you're going to get wrong information coming out. So for instance, in the middle of the screen, you'll see something. It's just a photograph of a sled. And this is called a Nansen sled, and it's named for a Norwegian explorer who worked in the Arctic. And now that sled, actually, curators and researchers who work at this museum will tell you that it's not actually called a Nansen sled. And indigenous people of the Arctic region have, especially the Sami in Finland, they have another word for it. It's their sled. And they've been using that for many, many years, decades, centuries. Now, the actual Sami name or the word in indigenous languages of the Arctic, like in Greenland and places like this, the word or the name for it is nowhere in the training set, is nowhere in the training data set. It's only referred to as the Nansen sled. Now, going forward, a museum wants to actually recognize that there are hidden histories to many of these artifacts, and they don't want to actually be putting out wrong information or knowledge. But the scale of AI is such that you can't change every single instance. So how do you think about small, bespoke, eccentric, and messy contexts where you have these very specific histories and very specific requirements and these contested kinds of knowledge? I mean, you're not just asking for a recipe to bake a cake or, how to organize a birthday party for a child. The AI models that we have, generative AI, kind of works at a very random, lowest common denominator scale. And the lived reality of working with AI means we have to think about these bespoke or specific contexts and ask very hard questions about how does it work for this sector? How does it work for this community? So that's what we're trying to do here. And I've just put the link to Provisional Semantics, which is a project in the UK about um, how to talk about artifacts and histories when there is so much of a legacy of colonialism and violence, and what is the right kind of language to use. So this is a beautiful resource it's a very dense, extensive resource into think about naming in archives and galleries and libraries and museums. If you're interested in that sector, it's fantastic. Actually, in any sector, it's very good resources. And I think, and so just to end, what we're specifically going to do at the Scott Polar is we're looking at one set of artifacts. They have a database of something called a scrimshaw. A scrimshaw is actually the word comes from an old Dutch word. And it's these the teeth of whales or gums, teeth of whales, walrus tusks that whalers in the 18th and 19th century who were part of these voyages, long voyages around the world, they would pass time by making artworks, by etching and scratching on these tusks and teeth, and then rub black soot or ink for the so we're going to actually work with these with this database to ask how can a small and eccentric collection, like, can we, what kind of like basic techniques can we use with this artifact to kind of organize it or to create searchable interfaces for experts like scientists working in this area or researchers or artists working in this area, but also for the general public. So whether it's about being able to search through them or understand the styles and techniques of the artworks that of the artistic practice of this community, and how do you tell the histories of these artifacts. So this is very early stage work where we're working with a collection, and these are just some other images I put in there of asking from Runway actually, what does it look like? Um, the phones. The word scrimshaw actually means to while away or to waste your time. And this is what people did on long voyages on ships when they had nothing to do. It was a way of passing the time. So the prompt that I gave to Runway was show young people wasting their time. And the image that came back was of people on their phones. And I said in the style of, the scrimshaw, like a Victorian 19th century. And so they actually had like pictures of people on their phones, which I thought was quite funny because they didn't have phones, mobile phones in the 19th century. So I'm going to stop there. And please do stay in touch. And I'm very happy to take questions in the time that we have, which is probably only about 10 minutes at this point, I guess. Thanks a lot.